you want to understand eschatology, what is the core, what is the root of it? It's the Jewish people. And specifically, since when we talk about eschatology, we're actually talking about time, it's the timeline of the Jewish people. So this is we're to the heart and soul of eschatology at this point in time. What do we need to talk about? What does this area talk about? It talks about the Jewish people going from wherever they were when prophets spoke to the place ultimately that all of the prophecies lead to, and that is the Messiah reigning and ruling over the Jewish people from Messiah, or from Jerusalem. And so that is really the central core of everything eschatologic. How do the Jewish people go from whatever prophet you're dealing with, whatever time they were speaking in, from that point, how does the Jewish people, how does their history unfold that leads up to ultimately the Messiah ruling and reigning over them? So that's the heart and soul of everything, and as I've told you before, everything revolves around the Jews, Jerusalem, and I'll add this little one to it, Jesus. The Jews, Jerusalem, and Jesus. This is what eschatology is all about. Now, we have to pick up some of the concepts that are key to this, and the first of these is just the concept, of course, of the Redeemer, Prophet, King. Now that sounds like a mouthful. What do I mean by that? Well, in the books of Moses, the subject is first introduced to us. We picked it up in that first piece of the Proto-Evangelion. Remember when we were talking about that out of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. That first mention of the gospel, it was a mention of a Redeemer. There was someone who was going to come and undo the curse, who was going to get us out from under that bondage. That was a male singular child of Eve. So Moses introduced the subject of the Redeemer very early in the book of Genesis. By the time you get to the end of the book of Genesis, or near the end, in Genesis chapter 49, there you have just the prophetic announcements being laid upon all the sons of Israel, all the sons of Jacob. And when he got to speaking his piece over his son Judah, he mentions in that a very prophetically significant statement that the scepter belongs to Judah, and it's going to be his until he who deserves it, or he that it is appointed to, comes. That's that famous "until Shiloh comes" verse in the Bible. And so we have this snippet also in the midst of Mosaic writings in the Pentateuch there. We also have this opening up of a reality. Not only is there a Redeemer that's promised, but that the king, the authority of a king, is going to come out of Judah. So these two promised figures are, actually what we'll discover as we look at this more, they're actually talking about the same thing, the same person, if you will. So we have that. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 18, now when we talk about this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 18, it's interesting because it is got a very prophetic flavor to it, something that we see often in biblical prophecy. And what I mean by this is just this, is that there's something that is fulfillment of it that could be relatively close at hand, and then there's also something that is ultimate about it, that's not going to happen close at hand, but is further off in time, and that when it happens, it'll actually be a much more full and complete way. And you have this kind of quality here. We saw that in some of the other things that we were looking at. We saw it even in places like Daniel. But we call that dual fulfillment, right? Where you have something initially more close at hand that is a fulfillment of the prophecy, but you have to look through it because the prophecy is meant to say more than just that. You have to look right through that immediate fulfillment into something more future that is much more complete and much more full. And this this particular passage has that quality, Deuteronomy chapter 18. What's it talking about? It's talking about a successor to Moses. He is, in Deuteronomy, of course, this is his last address to the Jewish people before he's off the scene. Joshua's taking over and they're moving into the Holy Land. In the midst of some of the things that he addresses through the book of Deuteronomy, this is one in particular where he says, after he's gone, God will raise up for the Jews another person like him. This person will be a prophet like Moses was. This person will speak for God like Moses did. And this person needs to be accepted and regarded for his authority. And anyone who doesn't listen to what he says is going to be on the outs with God. That's more or less the flavor of what this particular passage is talking about. Now it does go after it says that very heady thing that's very clearly seems to be pointed toward this messianic figure, this prophet, king, redeemer that I mentioned up here a little bit earlier. It goes on then, it says, it spells out something about the more immediate passage. It talks about prophets in a more general sense, in other words. And he says, this is how you know good ones from bad ones, and if someone doesn't do this, well then don't bother with them, don't fear them, okay? So he gives us some information near the end of that particular passage that is practical about, what do you do with those intermediate figures that have prophetic ministry. Maybe not the one that fits the fullest of the description that he gave at first, but people that nonetheless are being called into prophetic office after Moses, but are not necessarily the Redeemer, prophet, king. So that's all packed into Deuteronomy chapter 18. But ultimately, it does point to this significant figure. So Moses, in his writings, tells us that there is going to be a redeemer in blood, right? Because he's going to be bruised, he's going to be wounded in undoing the curse that was upon Adam and Eve. So we have this redeemer, we have this prophet, and we have this king. So you have this kind of trifold look at someone who is coming. Now, the Bible will start talking about in other prophetic writings, very significant in the book of Psalms. Also, we'll see this very much used in other places as well, especially through the historical books when it's talking about the intervening kings, not the ultimate king, but the intervening kings that come after David's line. Always talking about things of the anointed. That word anointed, if you translate it into Greek, it comes out as Christ. So anointed and Christ, same thing, mean the same thing. The Jewish word for it is actually Mashiach, or Messiah. And so Messiah, anointed, Christ, all the same words. Different languages, all the same words. Anointed, of course, is English. And then you have in Greek, you have Christ. And in Hebrew, you have Messiah. All of these are dealing with the same reality that somebody has been given the oil of unction, or the unction of spirit, I should say, from God. And so this figure that we're talking about, first get the first glimpses of it in Genesis chapter 3. This one who's a redeemer, who's a prophet, who's a king. He's the anointed one. And ultimately, God's end times plans are all about bringing this anointed one, this Messiah, to reign and to rule over the Jewish people. And so all that we have to look at in prophecy to understand it from the standpoint of timeline, from the standpoint of something that helps you understand where we are at in the scheme of things, is to understand that that's what it's all about. It's about bringing that Messiah to the throne in Jerusalem. Where are we along that path? It's going to happen. It's the most, if nothing else we can say about it tonight, we can say this. It's the earliest and the single most repeated prophecy throughout the entire Old Testament. The Messiah coming to his actual kingdom, coming to his actual reign in Jerusalem forever. Okay, so that's what that's all about. Now, the line of the king, we find as we move along in the Old Testament, and the prophecy was progressive in some point, because Moses didn't get it all back in his day. The generally held perspective is that Moses would have been writing around 1450 BC. Right? That's a general perspective. My perspective is that that's off by 100 years, that it would have had been around 1550 BC. So I have a little bit of difference with what is generally accepted as scholarly wisdom about this. But nonetheless, it was a long time ago. And Moses, that long ago, was not given everything prophetically that was necessary to get this message out. And it was more or less revealed in pieces by prophets from the time of Moses, basically to the time of Jesus. Bits and pieces of it. Now, in the midst of all of that, three pieces of revelation became central. We'll get to those in a minute. But along the way to them, one thing that needed to be done was to really establish the Davidic line. Why is that so necessary? Well, because the Davidic line is what identifies the Messiah. David became the model. A lot of things that David said, a lot of things that were said to David by God, were not necessarily said about David himself. Just about all of it was, but a lot of times when God was revealing something to David about his place with God, his relationship with God, God's commitment to him as a king, a lot of times it wasn't just about David. It was actually David because he was a model, because he was the prototype of this anointed king. Those things were actually spoken about the ultimate one who would follow. So a lot of the things David experienced, a lot of things David heard, a lot of the things that David wrote and spoke, they really were not necessarily about him specifically. Oftentimes they were pointing forward to the Messiah, to the one who would actually fulfill what David was the prototype of. Now this line of kings was specified 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse number 11. That's probably the first place in the Bible where it's really clearly designated that David is that one, the one who's going to produce the Messiah. After that point in time, now, when was that? Again, my chronology is a little bit different. Most people would say David was in the first century of the second millennium BC. In other words, between 1000 BC and 1100 BC. I think he was possibly a little earlier than that. Not much earlier, maybe 40, 50 years, but I think he was a little bit earlier than that. But nonetheless, that's when David was first clearly specified. So we go from Moses, maybe back as far as 1500 BC. The next thing that really starts working this thing, narrowing it down, clarifying how you get from point A to point B in the prophetic timeline. You go from Moses getting the Jewish people established in the promised land with the promise fuzzy about something that's going to come. Then you get to David, and suddenly we realize it's okay. It's not just from Judah, now it's specifically from David. Things are starting to get narrowed down and clarified and focused. And this is happening in this passage, and numerous psalms. There's so many psalms. There's 150 psalms in the book, and I actually think that that's a bad number, because there is one that's actually repeated word for word, and I don't know how that's another psalm, but according to our Bibles and numbering it is. And then there's one psalm that is so clearly a continuation. I don't know why it's two psalms, but it is. So anyhow, there's at least 148 psalms. And so many of them, so many of those psalms, it is just spattered throughout that whole work, especially those that were written by David. Not all of them were, the biggest chunk were, but not all of them were written by David, but so many of them are so prophetic about the Messiah, about his kingdom, about his reign, about his passion. You go to Psalm like Psalm 22, right? There are so many psalms that are about this. I just put numerous psalms. I didn't want to cite every specific thing. It would take in a whole slide and maybe another one to do that. But I did give you a couple examples to look at. Psalm 2, Psalm 110. Both of those are very interesting, and they give you a good example. Because in both of those psalms, it's not just a verse that kind of is, popping out of nowhere, but is messianic. Those whole psalms are. So all of Psalm 2, all of Psalm 110 is actually important for understanding this particular concept. And then, of course, we have Isaiah. He's prophesying in the 800s BC, so he's moving in the 700s. He's much later, than David. I mean, we're now another 300 years or so closer to us in time. But he has incredible insight that God moved him by the Holy Spirit to give to us about the Messiah, about what the Messiah would do, about the redemption. Remember, we talked about Genesis 3:15, setting up Jesus or the Messiah as the Redeemer. Isaiah, just absolutely incredible, and of course, probably the thing that's most noted there is Isaiah 53, right? You have that incredibly long psalm, really well-developed prophecy about the work of the Messiah in his passion, in his sacrifice. And so, but these passages really key in to the Messiah in the Davidic line, that he is definitely connected to this particular line. It's not just that he's coming, we had Shem, and we had ultimately, then we had Abram, and then we had, finally we got down to Jacob, and then from there we went to Judah, and then we got David, and so, it's narrowed down. Now, we're talking about the Jewish chronology. In Jewish history, there is if we consider Jewish history to be a nice, beautiful glass palace, a couple of really big rocks got thrown at that glass palace in history. This was because the Jewish people were ungodly. From the day of Moses, right up into the time that I'm talking about right now, the Jewish people had one thing that you could describe them as, and it would be unfaithful. They were not people of belief. They were not people of faith. They were disobedient to Moses, disobedient to Mosaic law, disobedient to Joshua, disobedient to anyone who ever came along and basically tried to lead them in the path of righteousness. They became incredibly idolatrous. There was problems with that from the very start. If you remember the stories of Exodus and what happened along the line, not once, but a couple of times. They had issues even when they moved into the Promised Land. Just always a people of unbelief. It doesn't make sense when they saw what they saw. I mean, to me, I try to understand. How could the Jewish people in that day have responded to God in the way that they did? I don't think that they were necessarily any more wicked than any other people, but I just, it boggles my mind. But then I think about people today, for instance, and I think, would the people today in the same circumstances as the Jewish people, be any different than the Jewish people were, I kind of doubt it. You know, people have this wonderful capacity to ignore anything that they don't want to be true. Right? If they want to do something else than what is being asked of them, if they are being directed in a pathway that is going in the other direction from where they wanted to go, if they just don't like the impingement that it has on their freedom to do whatever it is that they want to do. I mean, I see people today in the kind of framework that makes me think, well, you know, would today's people thrown into the desert with Moses have been any different than the Jewish people? Probably not. I guess I'm saying this, is that as bad as the Jewish people were, I don't think it's because they were more wicked than any other people. I don't think it's because they had more trouble trusting God than other people would or did. I just think it's just the nature of the human race. And this was just part of the human race that God happened to choose to get some work done through. And He didn't choose them because they were holy. He didn't choose them because they were good. He didn't choose them because they were faithful. There were some people in the midst of them that were, of course. But, you know, as far as the population in general, the Jewish people, God chose them because He chose them. And He didn't do it because they were fantastic or anything else like that. He didn't do it because somehow or another they deserved His attention. But He did do it because He had a plan to bring redemption to the earth, and they were part of it. And so, I say all that just to say this, is that all of that unfaithfulness, all of that unbelief, all of that idolatry, all of that wickedness, it just kept on piling up and piling up and piling up until things got so bad that God said, no more. Now, the Jewish kingdom, and most of you are aware of this, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time developing this history, but most of you know that right after Solomon went off the scene, his son Rehoboam, was king in his place. Solomon had worked the people so hard with all of his building projects and his wars and everything else, that basically when he died and was off the scene, they came to his son Rehoboam and said, hey man, this is too much. We can't do this anymore. You've got to give us a break. And of course, Rehoboam didn't listen to his father's counselors. He didn't listen to the older people who had been around the block. Same problem all the time, right? young people get power and they don't listen to anyone that's been around the block. There was a certain impetuousness in his actions, and he ended up, because of that, causing a split in the kingdom of Israel. And the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah, with Simeon, within the midst of it, forgotten by this time really, they stayed together, Benjamin and Judah, and that nation became known as Judah. And the other tribes, the other 10 tribes, if you will, they stayed together and became known as Israel. And so Israel was no longer had a capital city as Jerusalem, no longer had temple worship centered in Jerusalem. They split off and went into their own kind of idolatry, and things just went from bad to worse for that group of people. As bad as they had been up to that point in time, they just kind of like were on the slippery slope, and they started sinking faster and faster. And so by 722 BC, the situation in Samaria, as it was sometimes called by its capital city, in Israel, as most often we see it from the Bible records, Israel had gotten so bad at that point in time that God said, He basically brushed the dust off of His hands and said, I'm finished with you. The Assyrians came in. They were a very brutal empire, even by the standards of the day. They came in and they just, what they didn't kill, they moved out, they wiped out, and Israel was gone from the scene. if you've ever heard of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, that this is how they got lost. When Assyria came in and not only dispossessed them, but actually deported them, moved them out of the land, records were not kept. The cohesion of the community did not hold together. And so for all intents and purposes, all of those exiles were lost to the knowledge of history. And so because of that, there are people that can go around and say, oh, the lost 10 tribes, they were in Britain. Or the lost 10 tribes, now this is Joseph Smith, they're the American Indians. Or the lost 10 tribes are this or that. People come up with goofy things. And most often they are absolutely goofy. But here's the thing, is even though they're lost and there's just really no way for us to recoup the historical records that it would be necessary to find them, I mean, for all intents and purposes, there's no human way to relocate them or to locate them again. But the Bible, I think, does say and does promise that God knows where they are, and at the end of time, He's going to pull them back out from wherever they got lost to. So, this is a stone, though, on the glass palace, man. This is a big old rock. It's thrown on the glass palace of the people of God. It shatters. It's gone. Oh, no. Is it all done? Is the promise over? Is the prophecy finished? It would appear so at 722, at least for a good portion of the Israelites. The southern kingdom continued on, only marginally better. The southern kingdom, had, in some respects, it still had the Levitical priesthood, still had the Aaronic high priesthood, still had, prophets of God, still had some ministration that kept them more or less, at least nominally, on the pathway of Mosaic obedience, but really their hearts were far from it, and everything that they did that may have been somewhat, at least nominally, obedient to the Mosaic code was actually just being said out of one side of their mouth, while out of the other side of the mouth they were worshiping idols, they were making offerings to all kinds of things, Asherah poles and whatnot, under every high tree, under every mound, all throughout Judah. There was a few moments, like during the reign of Josiah, the reign of Hezekiah, a few others, moments where kind of revival came across them. That never happened in the north. The north never even slowed down. They just went down the hill and were done with it. But in the southern kingdom, there were spaces and moments when things seemed like maybe, they would get their act together and follow God. But ultimately, they didn't, and they ended up going just as bad as the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Samaria or Israel. And in 586, they were utterly destroyed. Now, this started in 605 BC. At that point in time, in 605, once Nebuchadnezzar had taken care of that, he came down into the Holy Lands, and he stopped at Jerusalem. And he was not happy with their approach to him at that point in time. So he took tribute, because they had allied with the Egyptians. He took tribute, and he took a bunch of hostages. Now, when we talk about the exile of Israel, this is where it starts. I've actually read some histories that miss this. Even in places like Encyclopedia Britannica, it's like, my goodness, your history is patently false, demonstrably false. You miss out what happened in 605. It's very clear from other histories, and it's clear enough in the biblical record. But I say all this to say this: when he took those hostages, he took the best of the best. He took the brightest. He took the ones with the best bloodlines, nobility, princes, and whatnot, cousins to the crown, and all of that kind of thing. And there was one name that he took out in that time that's notable for everything that we do, prophetically, eschatologically. It was Daniel, right? Daniel was just a whippersnapper, right, at this point in time. But he was in the noble family. His bloodline was of nobility, and so Daniel got snatched out at that point in time, and away he went to Babylon. Probably just a wet behind the ears teenager, no more than 15 years of age, maybe even less, and off he went to Babylon in 605. Which is the thing that I was really getting at when I was talking about this 586 number. I wanted to stop there to explain where Daniel came from. A few other things happened after 605, right? You would think that, after Nebuchadnezzar whooped everyone's behind, it would be quite clear who was in charge. But the Jewish king didn't get that. And he paid tribute for about 3 years. And then he decided, I've had enough of this. My uncle's in Egypt. I like the Egyptians better. They're closer. I'm going to try to side with them, and I'm going to turn against Babylon. And so he did. And so who came back? Nebuchadnezzar came back and laid siege to Jerusalem. And in 597, of course, things were capitulated. And at that point in time, the king, his family, and a whole bunch more of the established people and the important people, they got taken hostage. And they went out in 597 BC. There's a famous one that we'll be talking about in the midst of all of the things that we'll talk about that went out at that time. It was Ezekiel. Ezekiel got shipped out at that point in time. So Daniel went out in 605, Ezekiel went out in 597, and you would think that that would solve things. It didn't, because Zedekiah, who was actually put in place by the Babylonians, the next king, he got in his mind that he did not want to bow down to the Babylonians, and he rebelled. And guess who came back? Nebuchadnezzar came back with his army. And this time they didn't take prisoners. Not in the same sense. I mean, they did take exiles. But what I mean by this is that they had taken bits and pieces of temple furniture in 597. They had basically left the city alone except for some gold and tribute and whatnot in 605. But in 586, they met business. They'd had enough. And so what they did was basically destroy Jerusalem. I mean, they just tore it apart. They burned down the temple. It just absolute destruction. And they did that not only to Jerusalem, they did that to a lot of what was left in Judah, a lot that was left in the surrounding area. I mean, they went on a destruction binge and wiped it out. Whatever was left of any merit, and when I say by that I mean if you were a craftsman, if you had some skills in some way, if you had even a modicum of money, all of those people they exiled out. They left behind the poorest of the poor. And that was it. And when they left, when they exiled all of those, most of the area that used to be the, Israel, both Israel and Judah, most of it got desolate. It was, for the most part, uninhabited. Over time, other people moved in, Edomites and various Moabites and things of that nature. But for the most part, what you had was the utter, at that point in time, 586 BC, the utter destruction of the Jewish people. You had the 10 tribes that had been lost well over 100 years by this point in time. And then you had what was left, that little remnant out of Judah that hadn't been killed in all those campaigns, basically living paupers' lives in exile. And that was it. And it looked like the end of things. It looked like all of those promises made concerning the Messiah, all of those promises concerning God's plan for the end of time. It was the second big rock thrown at the glass palace that was Israel. And at that point in time, it looked terrible. And so I say all that just to say this, right? Hope seemed dashed with the defeat of Israel, the exile in 722 and 586. So at this point in time in 586, there was a question of whether or not the plan was still in place, whether or not, if it was, how in the world could it possibly come to pass? I say all that to set dramatically this next slide, right? This was the very question that Daniel in 586 was dealing with. Absolute destruction, absolute dispossession. You know, how in the world can all of the promises that were spoken, all of those prophecies, how in the world could they still be intact? Were they intact? What was going to happen? How was it going to end? Daniel had that question. You see him musing over it in Daniel chapter 9, where it says that he was looking at the prophet Jeremiah, and he was seeing that the captivity was set for 70 years. It wasn't apparent before, but in studying the scriptures, there it was. It jumped off the page at him, and he recognized it. And this was something that had been, troubling him. It was still troubling him. What's going to happen to the Jews? This was the same. This was the same basic issue hundreds of years later when Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and talking about the scattering of God's people. His disciples said, "What? When's this going to happen? What's going to be the sign of the end of the age in your return?" So they were filled with the same kind of question. We see that at the very beginning of the Olivet Discourse, particularly in Matthew chapter 24, as it's presented there. And this is the same kind of question that was in the heart of John. Now, John, the Apostle John, 95 AD, he's the last one alive who was with Jesus. Everybody else is dead. Everybody else is gone. No one else is left who walked with Jesus, who talked with Jesus, who heard from Jesus. No one else is left who saw him risen from the dead and ascending into heaven. He's the last one who saw him. And he's getting to be old. And he's been exiled to the Isle of Patmos. And you just gotta believe that he's thinking. All alone there, really can't do all that much. As far as, the work of being an apostle, planting churches, doing all those kinds of things. He's got to be thinking, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the followers of Christ? What's going to happen to the Jewish people? How's it going to end? And I say all that to say this, is that those three people, Daniel and the disciples listening to Jesus, and also John, they all had a similar situation in their particular times, and looking at what was promised for the Messiah, what was promised for the end, and wondering, how's it going to come? How's it going to end? How's this going to work out? And in all of those three situations, and no place else in the Bible like in these places that we'll be talking about, is answers to that particular question given. So when we talk about the book of Daniel, when we talk about the Olivet Discourse, and when we talk about the Apocalypse, and we talk about the revelation of Jesus Christ to St. John the Divine, as it's called in some really old Bibles, when we talk about those three areas of the Bible, they all are extensive. They all deal with a great swaths of time. They all deal with a lot of details about how things pass through that swath of time. And they all deal with it with a level of fullness, and in my thinking, a level of clarity that absolutely is uncompared any place else in the Scripture. So when you talk about the subject of end times, and in particular, we talk about what that means. It means the Messiah coming to Jerusalem and reigning and ruling over the Jewish people, right? When we talk about end times, these are the places that are the very spines, scripturally, of understanding everything end times. The book of Daniel, the Olivet Discourse, and the Apocalypse. Everything else that you find in the Bible is just blips. Bits and pieces here and there. No other places deal with it extensively with any kind of depth like these places in the Bible. So, Daniel, the Olivet Discourse, and the Apocalypse, the spine of eschatological prophecy. So, we're going to be spending some time trying to look at what these particular places are trying to tell us, how they fit together with each other, and the picture overall that they give us of how things are going to, how's it all going to, just to give you some idea of what these works do. In the book of Daniel, not everything in the book of Daniel is about end times. Chapter 1 is not about end times. Chapter 3 is not about end times. Chapter 4 is not about end times. Chapter 5 is not about end times. Chapter 6 is not about end times. But chapter 2 is, even though you wouldn't think so. It is, because it talks about large swaths of history and what's going to be happening in relation to Jewish people through that swath of history. So Daniel chapter 2 is actually an end times place. Daniel chapter 7 is incredibly an end time place. And believe it or not, it deals with a period of time that goes further than Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 kind of steps back a step, but again, it's still dealing with end times subject matter. So the Greek period specifically. Daniel chapter 9 through basically, really, to tell you the truth, you can throw 10 in there because 10 is kind of like the setup for what ends up being chapter 11 and 12. But Daniel chapter 9, 10, or 9, 11, and 12 are very much end times places. Daniel chapter 9 is where we see the 77s for your people in your city, that incredible vision that lays out a timeline with a lot of specificity. And then we have in Daniel chapter 11 and 12 how the kings of the north and the south develop. Now this is dealing with basically stuff that was first mentioned in general back in Daniel chapter 8. But the kings of the north and kings of the south, those are the remnants of Alexander's empire. Alexander died, left no heir, his generals split up his empire. One of them ended up being to the north of the promised land, one of them ended up being to the south of the promised land. Hence the king of the north, king of the south. The guy who was in the south was a guy called Ptolemy. That became the Ptolemaic kingdom, or empire. And the guy who was in the north was Seleucus. And so the Seleucid Empire, that's the king of the north, king of the north, king of the south, that progresses and stays mostly in the Greek period until it gets to the guy that you have double fulfillment there. When it started talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a prototype of the Antichrist, when it gets to the place where it's talking about him, right in the middle of it, it jumps forward to the last, the ultimate Antichrist. So that's Daniel's chapter 11, and then it finishes off talking about that in Daniel chapter 12. Matthew 24, the whole chapter for the most part, whole chapter Luke 21, whole chapter Mark chapter 13. That's where the Olivet Discourse is found. We have three versions of it. Matthew chapter 24 is probably, I would say, the longest one and the one that's most detailed. But all of those spend a lot of times talking about it because the Olivet Discourse is Jesus' answer to the question. Now, they had been walking in Jerusalem. Jesus said, everything you see, not one stone on another is going to be left, all going to be destroyed. That led the disciples later on Mount Olive, the Mount of Olives, hence the Olivet Discourse. Later on in the Mount of Olives, at their little camp, if you will, they asked him about that. And the response that he gave to answer their question is what the Olivet Discourse is. So that's in that place, and it deals with things like some of the things that Daniel talks about in here, the abomination of desolation. It talks about the rapture. It talks about all things that are end time. So that's the Olivet Discourse. And then finally, the entire book, of course, of the Apocalypse. All of it. It's probably the most extensive thing that we have in the Bible dealing with end times, but it is divided into different series of things. You have 7 letters to 7 churches, and then you have 7 seals, and then you have 7 trumpets, and then you have 7 vials or bowls of judgment, and then you have a bit of an interlude after those things get completed. But all of it is meant to express and to put forward just the map, if you will, the timeline of how things are going to unfold until the Messiah is in place in Jerusalem, and the prophetic promises, for the most part, have all become fulfilled.